Welcome to the Chinese-Jewish Conversation at Yeshiva University. We're privileged today to be in a conversation with two young scholars. And I just want to say a word about the Chinese-Jewish Conversation because we had a follow-up lecture by Professor Ames, who spoke about the Confucian classics and their meaning for us today, which was paired with my own presentation about the Tanakh, the Jewish Bible, and how it's relevant for us today. And we have found over the course of these conversations a great deal that is common between the Chinese and Jewish cultures, and we feel that these are worth pursuing. The idea of comparing Jewish and Chinese cultures is more ambitious, but there's a lot there, and we're beginning to find that out. So I'd like to hear from both of you, if you could introduce yourselves, and we'd like to continue this Chinese-Jewish conversation.
My name is Debby Li Yidan in Chinese, and I study at New York University. I'm a graduating senior this year, this May. I study cultural anthropology and art history, but I'd like to pursue a career in archaeology, so archaeological anthropology.
I was a student at Yeshiva University. I graduated with a degree in anthropology and Jewish studies, and now I am pursuing a master's in Jewish history at Bernard Revel Graduate School. I'm also pursuing a degree in archaeology. I'm focused more on biblical archaeology, so the comparisons that Debby and I have found between our studies are very exciting.
There was a kind of kinetic energy between the two of you because your reaction to Debby's lecture was one of just, excitement that you guys found a lot in common. There are differences and there are similarities. So let's start with you, Rebecca. What was your take on Debby's lecture?
Well, I have always been interested in comparative studies of cultures because of my background in anthropology, and like you said about your book, in comparative Muslim and Jewish and Christian literature. I was very fascinated with that, but I didn't know that there was so much to be studied about the comparisons between Jewish and Chinese cultures. And when I heard Debby's lecture, her experience really resonated with me, being on an archaeological dig, as well as the content, which really seemed to strike me as being similar to what I have experienced on an archaeological dig in Israel, which seems to be a very different location and time period than what Debby is studying in Chinese culture and Chinese archaeology, but I realized that there are a lot of similarities that we needed to discuss further.
Well, Debby, can you refresh our memories what you learned in your conversation with Rebecca?
Right, so for my lecture, it was mostly an introduction to the Chinese prehistory, but also to Chinese modern archaeology as a field of study itself. And I mostly wanted what I presume to be a majorly Jewish audience to kind of get to know China from its very prehistoric beginnings, but also intertwined in the different informations about various Chinese prehistoric sites. I also wanted to convey how archaeology might be used in trying to express a Chinese lineage and trying to emphasize the same lineage that is done through archaeology and hand in hand with history.
This idea of lineage is very important and very interesting. So Rebecca, I wonder if you had any thoughts on that on the biblical side.
Yes, well, what Debby spoke mostly about, which she said is prehistory, is a very different time period than what I am used to studying and what my experience actually on the field is, which is mostly Bronze Age and Iron Age, which can span from around 3000 BC to around 1000 BC. But I did notice that the purpose that we had found in archaeological studies was very similar, that the lineage and the heritage was very important to us, that we both felt a connection to the study because of our connection to the culture. And I thought that was very powerful, that she's also a student who is trying to explore her heritage in a very physical and historical way, which really compelled me toward archaeology in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Debby, what was your feeling about that?
I feel like from what my limited knowledge about Jewish history, but also from the Old Testament that we also read in art history, there is both a historical and contemporaneous cultural parallel already. And then after I had the conversation with Rebecca, I realized that archaeology as a field of study is also used on very similar fronts for both our cultures, and I find that to be very interesting in how methodology and culture can interact in this.
Can I ask if you could elaborate on that, because it sounds really powerful?
So going back to the whole idea of lineage, I feel like for archaeology it's a very concrete way to secure our ideas about lineage for both the Jewish and Chinese cultures. Lineage is obviously very important for both of us. For me, myself, I didn't have many interactions with the Chinese culture as I grew up. I lived in China, but I was kind of always in the secluded international community, and I didn't really get to know local Chinese culture or history. So for me, after coming to university here, I found that re-studying, re-going back, sifting through all this history and then prehistoric archaeology, I was able to kind of get to know my own culture more, even though I was overseas. So in a way, for me personally, as well as for nationally, culturally, archaeology is definitely a way to secure one's own heritage and lineage, and then be able to publicize this for your own culture and now for other cultures as well.
So, going to Rebecca's experience, this is what the Chinese-Jewish conversation is all about. There's another parallel that is, I think, important to think about within our two communities. Jewish people grow up with a very strong sense of a diaspora, of a community outside of Israel. So Rebecca grew up in Brooklyn, am I right?
Yes.
Right, okay, so I grew up in New York. And going to Israel and seeing archaeological sites is kind of what you're describing, that someone from you didn't grow up in the diaspora, but you had external cultural influences. Rebecca going from Brooklyn to, the ancient land of Israel. Can you say something about your feelings about that?
Yes, well, contrary to what Debby described as her upbringing being somewhat outside of the culture, Jewish studies is a massive part of Jewish Orthodox culture, which is where I grew up, and it was always a big part of my school curriculum and my upbringing at home. So pursuing it in this way, even though it's somewhat unconventional, seemed very appropriate for how I grew up. And it was kind of just a very physical way to chase after the studies that I had in the Bible and in Jewish literature throughout the ages. It was just a different way to do it. A lot of people that I engage with and that I've studied with engage in kinds of scholarship, but this is a very different sort that Debby and I are engaging in when it comes to archaeology, because it is very on the ground, very interpretive art, and there's a lot to be discussed about archaeology as a form of scholarship, as opposed to just literature or anything else like that.
And I'd like to add that it's interesting how I grew up in a very localized Chinese, very concentrated Chinese community, yet I felt like I was secluded in a more externally, culturally connected bubble. Yet for Rebecca, she came from more of a diasporic background, yet you were able to kind of root yourself within this community, even though you were geographically kind of different or geographically separated from your own land. But archaeology is able to bring us together.
No, I think that's absolutely correct. Well, I want to thank you both for your time today, and we would like to continue this conversation at another point, but that's it for now. Thank you.